Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Future Space. I'm your host, Daniel Fox. Our guest today is Frank Slazer. Frank is the president and CEO at Coalition for Deep Space Exploration. He has 40 years of aerospace industry and Washington, D.C. space policy experience. Frank, welcome to the Future Space.
Thank you very much. And I'll just mention I started as a child intern, so it's not quite that daunting.
Wow. Well, there's a lot of wisdom there, I'm sure, and I can't wait to hear it. But first, Frank, what would be for you three words that capture the essence of space?
I think the first word would be mysterious. And I use that because I think there's just so much we don't know about space. I mean, if you think about it over the centuries, we've gone from just staring at hillsides and trying to make patterns out of stars to building things like the James Webb Space Telescope. But we really only have a good understanding, or halfway good understanding, of about 5% of the universe. And we didn't even know about the existence of dark matter and dark energy not that many years ago. And even things we thought we knew. I remember going to school and learning back in grade school that, Mars might have life, but the rest of the solar system's pretty much dead. And now we know there's oceans on various moons out in the outer planets, and might very well be life there. Even out at Pluto now, they've got some indications of organic molecules and indications that there's enough radioactivity inside the core that there could be a level at which there's a liquid ocean with potential life. So it's just astonishing to see how life is everywhere, and also how little we knew just based on our earlier knowledge, earlier observations, I guess.
And then your second word. So first word is mysterious. Second word.
Yeah, first one was mysterious. Second would be inspiring. And I think you just go out to a place that's away from light pollution. You go look up at the dark, moonless sky and you see the Milky Way, or even look at the moon. I mean, it just inspires people. It inspires wonder, inspires awe, and inspires people to dream. And I think you especially see that with children. Somebody a few years back, I think it was a former astronaut, observed that there's two things that really inspire kids to learn science. One is dinosaurs, and the other is space. And we don't really need that many paleontologists, and probably not that many astronauts either. But what happens is it winds up being like the gateway drug, right? They start being interested in space, and they start moving out and then go to medicine or engineering or different fields throughout the STEM continuum. And the third word I'd give you would probably be future. I used to have a bumper sticker on my car saying that space is our future. And I truly believe that. And we're already using space as a platform, right? We use it as a platform for telecommunications, for Earth observation, for understanding the universe. We're beginning now with the ISS to actually use it for research on bringing benefits back to Earth and doing things in space like manufacturing. And in the future, I'm quite confident, it's probably a long-term future, quite confident we're going to move out throughout the solar system and hopefully eventually onto the stars.
Absolutely. If you had the opportunity of go to space, either moon or a trip to Mars, would you take it?
Absolutely. As long as it's not a one-way one. I'm not one of these guys that say, go to Mars and stay there. I'd still like coming back for my earthly joys.
Yeah, absolutely. I found myself was it last year? I asked my wife that when we get old and we have maybe the opportunity will present itself, but you have on your way out of this life, you have an opportunity to travel and just basically, until you reach your end, would you be interested? And she's like, yeah, I could see that. I'm like, great.
Yeah. That'd be a good way to wind things up, shall we say?
Absolutely. Now, Frank, there's obviously a science story of going to space. There's a technology of going to space. There's even a political story of going to space. But what would be for you the human story of going to space?
I think going to space is just a continuation of the journey we began as a species when we moved out of the Olduvai Gorge in Ethiopia. I mean, I really think that humanity is an incredibly adaptive species. I don't think there's a single other species. There's probably a microorganism or something like that, but there's not really another large multicellular mammalian animal that can live everywhere from the Arctic to the equator and everywhere in between, dry areas, wet areas. We were really an incredibly diverse and adaptable species. It's kind of our killer app, right? And so what did we do with that killer app? We went ahead and we spread out of Africa up into Eurasia, eventually over into the Western Hemisphere. One of the things that I find most amazing, and it's probably most analogous to what we're doing now in space, is if you ever get a chance, maybe you have, you go to the Big Island of Hawaii, and in Hilo, the University of Hawaii has an excellent museum there about the Polynesian explorers. And I'm kind of wearing this shirt here. I was at Rapa Nui, Easter Island, right before COVID kicked us all off the airplanes in 2020. And it was just astonishing. You look at what those people did. They really had far less to go on than we did, right? They started out in Melanesia and they moved on to places like Tahiti and just navigating by the sun and the stars and using outrigger canoes with like animals and plants and people. And they made it all the way, not just to Hawaii, which is a pretty far distance from Asia, but all the way down to Easter Island. I mean, it's just astonishing when you think about not just the accomplishment, but the boldness that took, the confidence in the fact that you're going to be able to find somewhere to plant your feet. And those peoples eventually wound up establishing trade routes. And again, with that same technology, navigating by the stars and using patterns they knew about the wind and the currents in the ocean, really spreading throughout the entire Pacific Basin. It's an astonishing story, and it's probably the closest human analogy you can think of to what we're doing now in space.
I mean, it's what I think we don't give the human species enough credit. I mean, I don't think that the human species is a bad species. It's just that evolution is messy by design. But what we've been successful at is really becoming the best vector for life to spread and evolve and to go to to new places. And yes, I mean, people look at space as as a destination, but like you said, space is just the continuation, is more the future of our species within the context of outer space. But what we're doing, we've always looked over these horizons and tried to find how can we go to that next place, whether it was looking up at the mountain and figuring out how we can go either to the top or around it, or the first time that we found ourselves on the beach looking on at the ocean, it was just, wow, so that's the new frontier. Now I just have to figure out how. And as soon as we find the technology, the tools, then we start to go and push these new boundaries and these new destinations in space. It's not that space is new. It's just that now we have the technology that's more affordable and more accessible to people, and finally we can make it a reality. And after the space, then there will be, there will always be these new places that we want to push, but we're not doing anything different. And we find that the pushback also is nothing new, whether it's, siblings, within siblings, when children are leaving the family, or that someone is leaving the village, or like there's always a little bit of a sense of abandonment from the ones that leave behind, and they feel that their identity is threatened. But in reality, what it really does is that it elevates the stability and the security of the future, of everyone when one goes out and establishes their own life. It's never at the expense of who is left behind. It's really more at the support and elevating the entire experience, right?
My suspicion is if Columbus had not headed off to the New World because Queen Isabella decided she had to solve all the problems of Spain first, somebody else would have gone anyway. And the benefits that Spain got out of that in terms of treasure and power and that sort of thing. And yes, there were some terrible things they did at the time, but it benefited Europe. Think about the European diet. I mean, we go to Europe for the great cuisine, right? But they didn't have potatoes. They didn't have tomatoes. Those are all things that were imported from elsewhere. And it's going out there, finding these resources and bringing them back that really made those voyages of exploration incredibly worthwhile. There's probably more value to the foodstuffs they brought back than all the gold that they mined from the Incas or took from the Incas. So you really have to look at why do we do this? Well, it's worked out pretty well. I mean, we've not only expanded as a species, discovered new ways to do things, lived longer lives, lived lives of greater comfort in the end as we were able to develop technologies that allowed us to do less manual labor, that sort of thing. It's really worked out to be a good approach. And so I think people at some level all get that. And when you find people that are, if you poll people, you'll find that I think slightly less than half would say they'd want to go into space. And we just talked about that a little while ago. That's okay. Not everybody needs to go. I mean, I'd love it if people always had the opportunity to go, and I guess now if you're a billionaire, that may be there for some limited degree of time. But you don't need everybody to do it. You need a certain percentage of people who are willing to break the boundaries. And once these things get settled a little more and established a little more, you'll find a lot more people following behind. So I'm really confident that we've got the right stuff as a species to continue moving out and continue benefiting.
I mean, it would not be far stretched to say, but every single person, even more so in places like the Americas or Australia, exist because someone left their nest and went established. And there's in the back of my mind, there's a future. There are people ahead of, like, in the future that depends on us continuing expanding and going to these new places. And they will look back and they will say, I exist today because there are people who actually left the earth and went to start, anew. And that new destination is always offers the opportunity to start afresh, or try to, not do it exactly the same way that, the past did it. Like when the children leaves the family house, usually they don't want to repeat the same mistakes that the parents did. They want to create their own life. And, we realize we make the same mistakes, but we always try to build on top and make it better and expand the human experience. And I think that we really need collectively to reframe the human story as we move into space, and not think that we are the negative element in that entire life equation. We actually are an extremely positive addition to life. We look at, yes, there will always be conflict, but one of the things is you look at their history and you look at the trajectory of population and conflict. And for a long time, they were almost like parallel, one to one. And then at one point after the Second World War, life just exploded, and the conflict stayed fairly in check. Still conflict. So we do a lot more positive than negative. It's just that, as I was saying, life is messy. Is that something that resonates with you?
Very much so. And I think if you look at a good example of Canada, the United States, when you have nations that are relatively affluent and have abundant resources, you don't wind up in conflict. There's never really been a war since the two countries became independent nations. And throughout Europe, now we're at a situation where people have finally come to a situation with the EU. Obviously, Ukraine and Russia are a slightly different exception to the rule, but for most of Europe, they've reached that same point, and it's because they're not struggling for abundance, and they're realizing that cooperation and working together is far more rewarding, is far more economically productive. I do think it's also worth noting that if you think, as I understand it, anthropologists using RNA analysis of mitochondria have kind of figured out that, I don't remember the time frame, 100,000 years ago, something like way far back like that, the human species was down to a few dozen breeding pairs of individuals. And we got that close to extinction. And that was all in that same Olduvai Gorge. I don't think we really know what it was, whether it was a bad drought or a climate change or something like that. But whatever it was, we almost got wiped out as a species. And the more we moved out throughout the world, the less likely that became possible to happen. And now I'd contend it's impossible. Some people talk about climate change and other things as really risking extinction. I think it could certainly lead to a very unpleasant world and a place where we as a species would not want to go. But on the other hand, I don't think extinction is in the cards outside of an unknown asteroid coming in from out of the solar system at a unexpected direction and hitting us, which I think is extremely low probability.
I absolutely agree with you. I mean, yes, I don't want to dismiss the reality of climate change and the problems that are being generated and will be generated. There's a transfer of power. There's big migrations that are happening. Well, we took for granted now has to be reassessed. But the idea that our species has not survived through worse, it's being a disservice to the past. I mean, we've been through a lot worse, and there will be challenges also in the future. But I think that the success of our species is really, I think, is we rise in the worst of times. In good times, we become arrogant and just kind of disconnected from reality. But when really there's something that needs to be fixed, something that needs to be accomplished, something that needs to find a solution, we come together and we figure our way forward. And this is why we're about to go, we're going to space. And this is why we're about to be 8 billion, right?
I think, yes, that's exactly right. I think we underestimate ourselves all the time. And I'll give you an interesting example tied back to South America, just like Rapa Nui. If you recall, there was a book back in the 70s that I kind of read in high school or middle school, whatever it was, but called Chariots of the Gods. And this was a Swiss archaeologist who went to Latin America and saw things like the Mesoamerican pyramids and the incredible stonework in places like Machu Picchu and elsewhere, and kind of concluded that there's no way that these peoples could have done that, because he saw these indigenous cultures that he didn't think could ever have this kind of sophistication, which is just nonsense. I mean, it turned out he came up with a great story that aliens must have come and built these pyramids because, clearly these simpletons couldn't do this. But in fact, their ancestors did. In fact, we are an incredibly creative and capable species, and we will either adapt or fix this problem. And there's so many signs of we're getting there right now. It's going to take some time. There will be some rough years as we transition, that sort of thing. But you're already seeing major nations such as the United States and many in Europe and even China doing what they can to start moving towards renewable energy sources, and being much more cognizant of the environment and the impact we're having on it. So I do think you're going to see a peak climate impact, and probably take a long time for the global global warming gases that are there to dissipate or gotten rid of. But it will happen, and we will get back to a status where the climate is not out of control. And I think that's going to happen because of all the concern, particularly the concern of the young people now. I mean, whether it's Greta Thunberg or even kids just in a normal high school or a middle school, elementary school, kids everywhere know this stuff is happening, right? So I remember one time, not that many years ago, I was invited in as a guest speaker to my daughter's elementary school, and I'm talking to these fifth and sixth graders about, it might have been fourth and fifth graders, talking to them about the space shuttle. And one of the first questions they had was, well, what happens to the expendable tank and the shuttle solid rocket boosters once they fall off? Doesn't that pollution? And they were glad to hear that they reused the solid rocket boosters and refilled them and used them over again. They were not so pleased about the fact that the external tank just burned up. It just started at a very early age, that as soon as they start seeing what they see to be large waste, they start saying, how do we fix that? Why do we do that? Let's do something different. And I think that's permeating the culture more and more, and it's going to be how we get out of the situation we're in right now.
Now, I mean, the climate, the environmental anxiety is really real in the young generation. I mean, I speak to a lot of them, and there's a part of them who they feel like, they can solve the solutions and they're inspired about moving forward. And then there's a big portion of them who feel siphoned and just like full of anxiety, because they see, because the story that we've made about ourselves, about the environment, is almost like there's nowhere to go, because it's just like it's the cane of guilt, and it's looking into the past, trying to find someone to blame rather than moving forward with acquired wisdom. And the reality is that no one in the past, or even today, the vast majority of people don't wake up trying to make mistakes. We do things with the knowledge and with the technology that we have, and then sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes it works for 5 years, and after 5 years, then you have to find something new. I mean, even plastic. The first time the plastic arrived on Earth, or we created the plastic, they were held as a solution for the future, which with the Earth would be better. Now it's not the same thing. So I think that we always have to understand the complexity of the human experience, but also of life. Tension and conflict are built within the foundation of nature, because that's the only thing that it can assure to evolve. And what I hear often in the environmental world is that we know, because we know we should do better. And often my response to that is like, how many times have you been in relationships that were bad for you and you stayed there because the predictability and stability and the unknown, the fear of the unknown, those are powerful forces that often make you stay in places even though you should be moving. So giving ourselves a little bit of empathy and understanding the complexity of these changes, because changes is never, only a few people seek out challenges, but the vast majority of us are trying to shy away because change is the unpredictable, is spending effort and all this. Do you think that right now one of our challenges is to shift that story?
Very much so. I'll give you a great example of this, which is, as in the 19th century, early 19th century, people's homes in America and many other countries were lit by oil from whales. I mean, the whales were hunted to the brink of extinction in many parts of the world. There's populations are still struggling to recover even now. It would have been seen as an incredibly environmentally great improvement once you discovered that coal and petroleum, could provide light without killing the whales. And it was, right. We moved into that. Now we find out that that creates a problem. So now we're using things like solar cells, which, oh, by the way, benefit greatly from the investment that's been done over the years in improving efficiency for space programs. We're finding that we've got technologies that are being developed for other purposes, a lot of them for space program purposes, that can be adapted to this area. And this is where I get back to the point of space being inspiring. You need to get these kids inspired to go into these disciplines where we're going to have more of a base of people to think of new ideas. How do we do things better? And we need to challenge ourselves to do things better in a way that allows us to apply those improvements in other places. So, for instance, if you want to go to the moon, it costs a lot of money to bring things down to the moon. And if you bring things down to the moon, you don't really want to have to keep bringing more. It would be far, far better to recycle, right? So what are we starting to do in a lot of the world right now? I live in Southern California, so you find that the local water agencies, while there is some movement towards desalination and that sort of thing, the biggest thing they're doing is encouraging conservation, get rid of those big green lawns and put in more local plants and materials. But the other thing is recovering water from the waste system. And so you're actually able to recover water out of the sewage treatment plants, clean it up to where it's drinkable, and then they pump it back into the aquifer and use that to recharge the aquifer that is used for the base for a lot of the communities in the area. And that's the kind of technology I think that the more people see that we can develop these technologies that allow us to avoid environmental problems, I think the more encouraged people are going to be to go into these fields. Environmental engineering is an incredibly popular field right now. And I think you'll see that only growing more in the future. And I think space, again, helps that by getting students to start looking at studying science, technology, math, those disciplines that you need to have in order to be able to do something in those fields. The other thing I guess I should also mention is I still think it's a ways out there, but not crazy ways out there, which is bringing resources back to Earth, and most especially energy, right? So there's two potential ways that I could see energy coming back to Earth. One is solar power. I mean, you really have to get the cost of bringing up things to space down if you really want to construct kilometer long solar systems that can then beam power back down to Earth. You really need a lot of low cost way to get up to space. And the other thing would be potentially helium-3. If we can get we can get a fusion reactor, which is getting pretty close, actually, and a number of researchers are really getting close with that. The moon has a tremendous amount of helium-3 just in the regolith, just deposited by the sun over billions of years, and it's potentially harvestable. And if you brought that back in order to support the fusion reactor economy, again, a huge improvement to our way of life and less of a reaction to the environment, less of a negative impact on the environment.
But I wrote this piece about how like that vision of a battery economy is not going to happen without space mining. The idea that we can just transition to battery economy and think that there's not going to be an environmental impact. In fact, there's just going to be a different environmental impact. Already we're seeing, we're putting the number in the equations, and if we just want to keep it on Earth, there's going to be I think it's like hundreds of new mines. They're going to have to be dug for the metals and everything. So space, the problem with mining on Earth is not that we don't have the resources, is the extraction. But if we can get the raw material from outer space, either asteroids or other moons and that, are barren of life, obviously it's not going to be a question you want the asteroid or you want the moon, the moon or this one or another one, as at the expense of these resource rich areas, with people. And you want to transform, you want to leave Earth more as a national park, because now you can go and out, and import all that you need, to develop your economy, and you can also export what you produce. So it is, and the incentives in space are 1,000 times more important than they are on Earth, because again, because we're resource rich, the incentives are almost the opposite. Don't be efficient because it's cheaper to go and then get it from somewhere else. In space, that atom of transformed carbon that you have, that you bring with you, the idea of just opening the side door and throwing out the space is the most ridiculous thing. You have to figure out how to reuse over and over and over again. So you need to be efficient, and all this is going to trickle down, right?
I would totally agree with that. I also think you're spot on relative to getting resources from off planet. One thing we need to figure out though, and that's along the way of getting, besides getting launch prices down substantially, because that is really your big um, hurdle, I think, to reaching something like that. But the other thing you need to figure out is, how do you assure those communities right now that are benefiting from that extraction industry benefit from jobs or benefit in some other ways that allow that change to happen, right? So one of the things we're finding now, just recent infrastructure bill, or I forget what they're calling it, inflation bill that the administration passed, you wind up with people like Senator Manchin from a coal state, West Virginia, putting bottlenecks in there because he doesn't want his people left behind. And you can just look at that globally. You think about all the Persian Gulf states that rely on petroleum exploitation. You look at countries like Russia and African nations. They're all relying on these extractive industries, oftentimes in very detrimental situations for their local population. But it's what pays the bills, right? So we have to find a way to spread the benefits, or to figure out some way to make sure that we transition the economy, but we also transition people to different types of roles. And again, I think that's where you really want to find resources that are less expensive elsewhere, and that can make things cheaper to do on Earth, right? If you could suddenly, if energy was not nearly the driver of the economy as it is right now, either because you've got really low cost, highly reliable and available fusion energy, or solar power, either terrestrial or from space and beamed down, you can start enabling a lot of different things, choices, and lifestyles, right? How much work gets done just to keep us warm and lit? And if you got rid of that or made it incredibly cheap to do, how much would that free up resources to do other things, to cure diseases, to explore different ways of living with nature? It would give us a lot of freedom, because we have so many dollars in our pocket, and a certain amount goes towards gas and electricity and that sort of thing. If you're freeing up that money to do something else, it just expands the creative potential of people to tap into it. So I think that's another aspect that we have to recognize. But right now, I think that the nearest thing that I think is really impacting us as a species is, of course, climate change, and understanding how to, first of all, how it's happening, where the impacts are going to be greatest, and how we can try to mitigate it, either through, longer term, yes, of course, we have to, reduce greenhouse gases and get our energy balance better on the Earth so we're not constantly warming up. But there's going to be areas that need to, as the Dutch have done for centuries, figure out how to live below sea level, or live very close to sea level in an environment that might have storms and that sort of thing. And space can be incredibly powerful in terms of land use planning, understanding the Earth's cycle. I recall there was a Nova episode I watched a few years back where they talked about how the fishing off of the coast of Africa, which is incredibly important as a protein source for the locals, only happens because in Antarctica, glaciers melt, the fresh water sinks, and it kind of slides towards the equator as this big cycle of warm water, cold water cycling happens. And that brings up an upwelling of nutrients from the bottom of the ocean that, of course, feeds the fish, and that in turn, or feeds the plankton that feed the fish, and then that in turn feeds the people. We wouldn't have understood those types of connections nearly as thoroughly as we do now if we hadn't had access to space as a platform to look at. It's almost like if you're too close to something, you really can't see it. You might see the pixels in a photograph, but you really don't know what the image is. And space gives us the opportunity to get away from the Earth far enough that we can see how it works as a system. And it also gives the opportunity to look at other planets, whether they be Venus, which is a carbon dioxide hellhole, or Mars, which is kind of like a tundra planet, right? It's cold and icy. It does have water, but it's mostly locked in the ground and frozen. You can use the understanding of comparative planets to enhance your ability to understand what's going on with the Earth. And then we can also talk about the sun, same sort of thing, understanding the sun beyond just the solar cycle every 11 years and lots of things. How does it work? Is it over time? Is the luminosity increasing or decreasing? We're in a position where we could be at risk of another ice age, despite the fact that may seem like a luxury as we're getting into talking about climate change in the other direction. But really, space is just opening up all these different ways to understand our world much better and let us adapt and use it more wisely. And I think that's incredibly important.
I mean, the wisdom and knowledge of the native, but the early societies was understanding that everything is connected, right? Every species, the humans have more of a participant role in that ecosystem rather than thinking that we're separated from it. Then the era of enlightenment came in, and just like teenagers who want to separate themselves from their parent and think that no, I'm super independent. We saw ourselves as separated. There was nature and there's us, and then the relationship that we saw with our world, and we can go down to the why and the hows and the religion and these stories. But that's besides the point. Is that for quite some time we saw our relationship with the world as linear and just us taking. As a solo wilderness explorer, my years of being in the wilderness, nature has always been an exercise of humility when you realize that there are forces that are bigger than you, and there's no need to compete with them. It's just realizing that your goal is to dance with it, to roll with it. Now, the irony is that it's our technology that has allowed us to go back in understanding how things are connected. And I think that there's more and more now the realization that it's not our job to be disconnected, but more to be connected. And even as we go to space, I was talking to Alex Fielding from Privateer Space. I was at in DC and then in policy symposium. Like, everybody wants to move forward with that understanding of the complexity and the interconnectedness of all these different things. And as we get to space, I think we're even going to be reminded even more of these big forces that are bigger than ourselves. And there's no need to compete with the universe. We just have to flow with it and understanding that we have to take from the environment, obviously, because we have to feed ourselves, we have to continue growing, but we also have to give back. It's more of a relationship. It's a reciprocity with the world around us rather than just this taking without giving back.
Totally agree. And I think it was actually, it's a quote from Francis Bacon was something a long time ago, like 17th, 18th century. Francis Bacon said something like, you can never conquer nature. You can only understand and try to better use it. And that's exactly right. And while you're talking a little bit more about nature here, just in terms of international cooperation, space has provided an incredible opportunity for international space cooperation. And it started from the earliest days. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think the first Canadian satellite was actually launched by a U.S. rocket, right? And over the years, the U.S. established relations with a number of allied countries like Japan and countries in Europe and that sort of thing. And we've had this International Space Station in operation now for over 20 years. And it's just astonishing to me that first of all, it hasn't won a Nobel Prize yet, because the partnership is still continuing, even despite the tensions with Russia that all the other partner nations have right now. But beyond that, it's just in terms of how well the partners have all come through for each other. When the Columbia orbiter was lost, right? And the U.S. literally had no way to get people into space or support the ISS. What happened was the Europeans stepped up their HTV deliveries, the ATV deliveries of cargo, and the Japanese did the same thing with their transfer vehicle. And the Russians started flying more Soyuz capsules with crew and cargo, and the program kept going. And shuttle returned to the fleet, and we finished stocking up the shuttle, and then shuttle went away. And again, we were relying on the Russians for a long period of time, and now we've got the commercial crew and cargo programs that U.S. providers are now supporting the program. Matter of fact, they just had in the midst of the war and all the other sanctions and everything else going on, we managed to get a Russian cosmonaut launched to the ISS on a SpaceX vehicle. So it's, space has just been a remarkable demonstration of international cooperation and how it provides benefits, right? So you don't have to pay for everything yourself, but beyond that, you're tapping into the creativity and the potential of so many other people and minds when you do these cooperative programs. Think about this. Canada has like 5% Canada contributed to the James Webb Space Telescope. And I believe there's some instruments and that sort of thing that were part of what the Canadian contribution was. As a result, Canadian astronomers are going to have 5% of the time of the JWST, which over a 20-year lifespan is 1 year. Now, could Canada ever have launched a JWST without a massive, it'd be incredibly expensive for them. But the United States gained by getting that whatever technology instrumentation that they provided, and the Canadians are benefiting by having a whole generation of Canadian astronomers will have access to this superb instrument. You see the same sort of thing happening with Europe and other countries where these contributions pay back. And the other thing you get beyond just the contributions is the colleagues working together, right? There's no dividing line in astronomy. If you're a French astronomer, you have an insight into something with a supernova that may interact with something an Indian astronomer has discovered previous, or an American astronomer observes while he's using one of these tremendous instruments. So it really leads to even a synergy. I mean, I hate to use that word; it's kind of overused lots of times, but it really is a synergy that you get out of working together collaboratively internationally. And space is one of the best examples of that. There's the space station, there's lots of ways to calculate its cost, but it's certainly the largest scientific collaborative activity that we've ever done as a species. And it's just remarkable how much accomplishments we've got from it and how much more yet to come. We still have at least another 8 years, and then hopefully we'll be offloading the capabilities onto other platforms and doing things, once space station is gone, once the ISS is gone, it's just been an incredible success. And I think you're seeing the same thing starting to happen with the Artemis program, which is NASA's new program to go back to the moon. The Gateway program in particular, you have international contributions to that from the Japanese, the Canadians, the Europeans, and I'm sure there'll be other participants over time. So I think space is really leading the way for showing how nations can work together for their mutual benefit and actually get benefits that go beyond what the 1 + 1 = 2 kind of a contributions. You're getting synergies that, you're getting the square of your contributions, not just a simple additive process.
Teamwork and collaborations are definitely themes that keep coming back about space. Now, being mindful with your time, I do want to know briefly, you have 40, today, this year is your 40th year within the space industry. You've worked with some of the biggest names in the industry, and less than 2 years ago, you started the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration. Can you tell us a little bit, what is the goal behind the coalition and what led you to create it?
Sure. So first, I didn't create it. Actually, my predecessor, Dr. Mary Lynn Dittmar, started it. So I'm the second president and CEO here. But the objective of it is really true. If you look back historically, we went with Apollo to the moon, and we did our landings. And at the end of that program, 3 missions that we had largely built all the hardware for were canceled. 18, 19, and 20 had hardware that was, I think for 18 and 19, it was like 90% complete. You can see those lovely pieces of hardware on display at KSC and down at the Marshall Space Flight Center area in Huntsville, Alabama. So think of that. You built these moon rockets, and yet during the Apollo program, the only time that public support ever went over 50% was right after the landing. Apollo was not popular. And it was very expensive relative to the economy of the time, and people didn't see the purpose. Once you reach the moon and beat the Russians or the Soviets, that's the end of it, right? So Apollo got canceled prematurely, I would argue, and didn't finish up its missions. Then in about 1989, President George H.W. Bush came out with something called the Space Exploration Initiative. He wanted to go back to the moon and then on to Mars. And it lasted about 2 years, and then the whole thing got shelved, and we didn't talk about going to the moon or Mars for about 8 or 9 years, right? And then George W. Bush became president, and in the wake of the Columbia orbiter being lost, kind of set up a commission to look at, what are we doing with people in space anyway? And what they came back with were observations that there's no killer app. There's no one reason to go, but there's so many reasons to go that it makes sense. But it only makes sense if you're going to go out and explore and push the boundaries and do things that are new and do things that really bring a lot of benefit back to the Earth. And so he came up with a vision. I think it was kind of a 2020 vision at the time. It was almost like a little, I'm sure there was a little bit of communications joking there. But by 2020, they wanted to be back to the moon. And then beyond that, we wanted to go on to Mars. Well, President Obama comes in the midst of the Great Recession and kind of decides that he's going to cancel this program. I'd argue they looked at it, the amount of money they've been putting in never met the original plan. The program was going to be years late, and they decided to terminate it. And so here we are twice. We've had presidents who mustered all their Kennedy-esque logic and leadership and tried to make these things happen, and they failed. And so the question is, how do you get the message out more broadly? How do you build a coalition of hopefully industry and other stakeholders to really talk about the importance of exploration, and not just the importance for the space community? Sometimes in the space community, we say, we're going, and that's great. We are going, and I'm psyched for that, right? For the average person, asks the question, why? There's only like 15% of the public that thinks we should send people back to the moon. If you just ask that simple question, it'd be hard to give an answer, right? I have a flag back on the moon, Americans are back on the moon. But if you were to actually explain it in a way, as we did with Shuttle and as we did with Station, that helps people understand that we're doing this in a way that's going to create benefits for life here on Earth, and we're going to learn so much in the way of new technology and so much understanding of the universe and of our solar system and of the Earth, then people start supporting it. In fact, after Apollo's cancellation, NASA did just that. They brought in public relations experts, and they started looking at things like, the first airdrop test vehicle, the orbiter, it didn't actually have engines on it, but it was to practice landing, dead stick landings with it. It was called the Enterprise. It wasn't named after the U.S. Navy ship. It was named after Star Trek. And guess what? Who did they have for the unveiling of that? The Star Trek cast was there. And they just did all kinds of things like that. They reached out. They had a thing called getaway specials where you could launch relatively quickly and relatively cheaply experiments, whether for an industry. They actually had industrial astronauts for a while, or even just science kids, the science kits from school children. They set up spiders and tomato plants to see what the radiation environment would do to their future growth. And they brought the seeds back and sent them to schools all over the country. Right? So people saw a benefit and saw results coming from that. There was another great thing that happened with the shuttle program. Nichelle Nichols, who we unfortunately lost recently this year, Lieutenant Uhuru from Star Trek, she went ahead and was engaged by NASA to go reach out to communities of color and to women and try to make the astronaut corps look like America. And she succeeded terrifically. And we had a shuttle program that people could really identify with. That didn't happen with Apollo. Matter of fact, there's a movie out there called Summer of Soul. I don't know if you saw it, but it was a documentary. It was in Harlem in 1969, July 1969, while the Apollo landings were happening. And it was a lot of, I don't know all the bands that might have been there, but, that whole soul music regime at the time was really very active, and people were loving it. And they were interviewing people that day saying essentially, well, Apollo's landing on the moon, what does that mean to you? And the answers they got back was, that's something Whitey's doing. That doesn't have any meaning to me. This is my life. This is what makes difference to me. You didn't have an inclusive program then. Apollo was not. It was targeted for that. It was targeted for beating the Soviets to the moon first. There were some efforts to bring an African-American astronaut into the program, that sort of thing, but it was primarily just this mano a mano against the Soviets, right? Shuttle was more subtle than that, and it was more effective than that. And its shuttle program never dipped below 58% approval rating by the public. And in fact, when the program ended, it had a 68% approval rating, saying that the shuttle program was worth doing, even though we'd lost 2 orbiters and about 15 crew members. So if people see the value and people understand how these things matter to their lives, they support them. And that's kind of what the coalition tries to do. We try to do that to some extent on an educational basis, but to a larger extent, especially now under my leadership, we've been doing that more on Capitol Hill and trying to get the message out more to members of Congress. If you're a congressman or a senator and you've got like a NASA facility or a big rocket production factory in your district, it's pretty easy to say this is important to the nation, right? But most of them don't have that. And so we try to reach out and help people understand how these programs impact people here on Earth and how those benefit the nation and the world. And that's kind of our reason for being. We're also a trade association, so we look after our industry. And sometimes space companies and companies in the space industrial base have challenges, whether it's with dealing with COVID or whether it's intellectual property protection, things like that. But a lot of our focus is really just trying to make sure that exploration continues and that this is something that we as a nation don't back off on.
Well, I'm glad that we're in the same business, because that's exactly what I've been working out with the future of space. I'm not particularly focused on the space industry, but trying to more get the human story out of the space industry so that the non-space can resonate with them. Because it's all, when I was doing solo wilderness expeditions, part of my creative and expedition process was to plan 50% of it and then not plan the other 50, because I wanted to connect with the people that live there. I want to sit at a table, share a meal, hear their stories, and then discover, these places that I was visiting. And the big lesson was that even with the people that you disagree with in on the outside, we all start from the same place. We all want to be valued. We all want to have a meaning. We want to put food on the table, and we want to send our kids to school. We want to give them a future. Then after that, it gets complicated where it goes. And unfortunately, when it comes to space, often I think it was the same problem with the environmental movement. They made the change based on numbers when they created a negative story about why we should be changing. And no one, like, if you keep telling people that they're bad people, well, their self-esteem just goes down the drain, and then they don't want to be inspired and connected. The cane of guilt just works for so long. When it comes to space, as you mentioned, back in the Apollo, it was a competition story or a political story with the Russians. And now we hear a lot about the science and technology story of going to space. But there's a lot of people that don't resonate with that, because it's not, it's not their lives. But what connects them to that world is that human story, the fact that we all exist because we're continuing doing. And it's not about space where we're going. It's about the future of our species, just within the context of outer space, for the benefit of the Earth. Frank, I know that we're running. I don't want to abuse your time. You're accessible on LinkedIn. You're based on the West Coast, but you spend a lot of time on the East Coast. Briefly, with your 40 years and your experience and your knowledge and your understanding of the human psychology, what would be your words of wisdom?
I had I had an intern one time. We were talking about all of this stuff with space policy and everything. And this applies to life in general, but linear extrapolations are never correct. I mean, maybe over a short time frame, but the world is an immense, complex place, and it interacts in ways you don't expect. And so, when you look at our future in space, it's very easy to say, "Oh, we're going to build a space station, and we're going to go to the moon, then we're going to Mars." I don't recall ever hearing, when people were talking about the great things coming from space in my youth, we'd have Wi-Fi from the sky everywhere 24/7. Or that I have a phone in my pocket with a nav system so I would never get lost, ever. I mean, if you think back before nav systems and cell phones or Garmin's or things like that in cars, how many hours did the human species lose every year because they couldn't find someplace? So space has changed the world already in ways we don't recognize. I'd even give you another example of that, which is just that the Apollo program ended. Well, the people didn't end. All those people that studied science and technology and were doing those things, they went on to become people that created the IT industry and became the revolutionary for the entire world of how we live things. So do the right thing in the short term, and certainly look out for each other, look out for the planet, and do things that are inspirational, and just watch. You're going to see things develop that you never thought would happen, and very often very beneficial. I mean, we talked a little bit about some of the bad things that might have happened with climate change and that sort of thing, but we'll adapt to those. We'll figure those out. We'll fix those. But on balance, I'm incredibly optimistic about the future of us as a nation and us as a species. And I think space is going to be a big part of that. It is the future.
Great words of wisdom. And yes, we definitely have to give ourselves more credit and our capacity to solve the issues and how we're going to be moving forward. don't want to be naive in thinking that, the world is rosy, but believing in their capacity to rise up, even in the worst of times. I think that the story that unites. We got to make sure that all the links, for the coalition and for your LinkedIn profile and your other social media and ways to reach out to you are in the description. Frank, it was a pleasure. I'm really glad that Meredith connected us, and I find myself often down south or even in Washington, so I'm looking forward for our path to cross in real time.
That would be terrific. And probably the best way to follow me on a regular basis is at FSlazer on Twitter.
Excellent.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Frank, thank you.